Hey everybody, I've been asked repeatedly, what are my favorite games, what are your top 10 games, top 20 games, etc, so on and so forth. So I finally decided, you know what, let's go ahead and settle this once and for all. Here are my top 10 games of all time. We're starting things off with one of the all-time greats. This is Age of Empires 2. What you're seeing in the video is the HD edition, which is why the title was the way it was. But regardless of whether you only played the original, or the Conqueror's expansion included with it, or you're playing the new HD re-release, you're treated to an absolutely fantastic real-time strategy game that has stood the test of time and is easily my favorite of the entire genre. Do I really need to say anything about this? I mean, it's friggin' Doom. Pretty much everybody has played Doom in some form or another. What you're seeing here is the GZ Doom source port, which makes it a bit easier to run on modern systems. And it's just a timeless classic, released 24 years ago and still an absolute blast to play. And as far as I'm concerned, if you haven't played the original Doom at all, then you're not a real gamer. At the very least, give it a try. You'll probably find that you're not going to be disappointed with it. Okay, look. Really, pretty much the entire Quest for Glory series belongs in this slot, but I had to pick only one, and my personal favorite of the bunch, even though it is objectively not the best game in the series, is Quest for Glory 3 Wages of War. It was my introduction to the series, and I just have the most nostalgia for it. But really, the entire series, with the exception of Dragonfire, is great. It's a combination of adventure games with RPG elements, and it's got a great sense of humor, the puzzles are pretty challenging in most regards, and it's just a lot of fun. And the persistent element between all 5 of the games also makes it a pretty unique experience. And like I said, the entire series really belongs at this particular part of the list, but since I can only pick one, I have to go with the one I'm most nostalgic for, which is Quest for Glory 3.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
It's actually legitimately amazing just how well System Shock 2 holds up to this day. Sure, it's got fairly clunky controls and the mechanics themselves take a lot of getting used to, but what you have here is one of the most atmospheric games ever made. The 20-year anniversary of this game's release is 2 years from now, and it still holds up as far as its atmosphere goes. It is amazing just how legitimately unsettling this game gets. And if you don't believe me, give it a try yourself. You'll probably be as amazed as I was. I feel like I'm going to repeat myself here from what I said earlier about Doom. Do I really need to say much about this? It's Duke Nukem 3D. It is one of the finest first-person shooters ever made. It's a love letter to 80s action movies, and it just oozes style from every single pore. Phenomenal level design, kick-ass soundtrack, excellent gunplay. It's just an absolute joy to play. And as it turns out, it's my favorite first-person shooter of all time as well. Honestly, I try not to separate the two Baldur's Gate games, but if I had to pick only one, it would be Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn. The writing is overall much more cohesive, and the gameplay is better in the sequel, so if you're gonna pick one, you gotta pick the sequel, but I really try to treat the entire series as one cohesive entity. Because Baldur's Gate 2, without Baldur's Gate 1, just wouldn't really be the same. What you have here is an epic D&D campaign in video game form, and it does that extremely well. Sure, it's not perfect, but there's a reason that this is often considered the gold standard for what you compare RPGs to. And it's also the reason that so many of those RPGs, when compared to it, are found lacking. It should come as no surprise to you if you've been following my videos for a while that I absolutely love adventure games, and this is my favorite of the bunch, the original Gabriel Knight, subtitled Sins of the Fathers. You could probably make the argument that Gabriel Knight 2 is better overall, and I'd tend to agree with you on a lot of that, but here's the thing. The original of Gabriel Knight just has it all, really. It has a well-written story, it has well-written characters, the dialogue is excellent, the voice acting is fantastic, the puzzle design's solid, and it really does hold up extremely well to this day. The sequel, while being somewhat better overall, has one fatal flaw. It's extremely dated because it uses FMV sequences, and it just ends up not having quite the same classic charm that the original does. You know how Bethesda's games seem to get dumber and dumber as time goes on, with Fallout 4 being a complete disaster and Skyrim being just completely brain dead? Well, guess what? Daggerfall is not that. This is Bethesda before the fame got to their heads. Massive open world, sure. Tons of dungeons and quests and things like that, sure. But it's also got 6 different endings depending on your choices and their consequences. It's got tons of character customization options. It's got a heavy emphasis on the actual RPG mechanics as opposed to click it until it dies. And even though it is plagued by Bethesda's trademark technical problems, it still holds up surprisingly well to this day. But of course, your average Bethesda fan these days wouldn't even be able to make it out of the starting dungeon without dying about 50 times. No hand-holding here, this is a good old-fashioned RPG. This is the Final Fantasy game with Cloud and Barret and Tifa and Aeris and Sephiroth in it, so therefore it's obviously the best one. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It's not like any of its predecessors were better than it. I mean, come on, it was released on the PlayStation. That was the best system ever. And anyone who tells you otherwise is clearly a moron. In fact, this game is so good that the amount of emotional charge it had was enough to make me cry. You heard me right. This game made me cry, it was so good. I mean, there's one particular event in the game, and you Final Fantasy fans know exactly what I'm talking about, that was completely shocking. It wasn't at all telegraphed, and I was just blown away. And after several minutes of just staring at the screen with my jaw dropped to the floor, I finally just gathered it all together and went, "You monsters, how could you do that to such a compelling and emotional character?" Honestly, I could spend the entire video talking about just how much of a masterpiece Final Fantasy VII is, but I gotta get back on track here and introduce you to my favorite game of all time. Do I even need to explain to you how this is the best game ever made? I mean, just look at the absolutely phenomenal graphics, the amazing sound, the fantastic gameplay, the extremely compelling story. I mean, think about it. This game is so incredibly amazing that the following 3 years just completely demolished most of the video game industry. Nothing could compete with E.T. on Atari 2600. It's just an absolute masterpiece, and it should be studied for generations to come, who no doubt will marvel at the absolute majesty that is E.T. on Atari 2600. Obviously, the best game ever made. There you have it, folks. My top 10 games of all time. Your persistence paid off because I kept telling you I don't do top 10 lists, but you made the demand known, so there you have it, my top 10 games of all time. thank you all very much for watching. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go back to playing E.T. because it's just that good.